Hello, well, we're back with Chapter 7 of Maurizio's Classical Mythology in Context, and that chapter focuses on Hermes and Hestia. Now, Hestia gets short shrift, but she gets short shrift in Greek mythology anyways. She's the goddess of the hearth, the fireplace, and so she's important sort of for the home, for the idea of home, but you can't really tell stories about a fireplace, so she doesn't really go anywhere. And she's sometimes paired in Greek art with Hermes, and that seems to be a pairing of opposites. She represents home, and he represents the wanderer, the traveler. But Hermes is going to get the main emphasis in this chapter. So one thing that I want to talk about that needs to be mentioned are the Hermes. The Greek would be Hermi. This sometimes gets translated as Hermes Hills. Now, what these Hermes are, where they start from, and why they're called Hermes Hills. In the country, you would come to a crossroads. When you came to a crossroads, you would take a pebble or small stone, and then you would put it in between the roads, the road where you were and the road that you were traveling, right? So there would be three possible spots right at a crossroads. And then you'd make a wish. So it's sort of like a wishing well type thing. And then, of course, as people do this over time, you would have a big pile of pebbles there, right? And those are Hermes Hills, those piles of pebbles. Eventually, that gets represented as a plinth of stone, so a block of stone that is not really carved. And then at some point they put a head on top of that. And there's also generally in the front of it an erect phallus. And those are the Hermes. And they served in the countryside, they served sort of almost like as road markers. But people had them in the cities as well. They were generally fertility symbols. They sort of represented the idea of like luck for the house and fertility for the garden, of the house. And also they served as apotropaic figures. That means things that ward something off, because of course the erect phallus could also stand basically for F off to anyone who might be intending to do harm to the home or the people in the home. So that's the bit about that. And so the connection with Hermes is there, although, we don't really have lots of stories of Hermes with an erect phallus, but the Hermes definitely have that. The main literary piece in Chapter 7 is Homeric hymn number 4 to Hermes. And it represents Hermes as a trickster figure, which is what he mainly is. Hermes, Homeric hymn number 4 to Hermes, it is basically Hermes. He's a 1 day old infant, right? He was born the day before. He gets up, and he immediately then has a bunch of adventures. But he still looks like a baby. So he's acting like his adult god self or his older god self, but he still looks like a baby, right? So think of it like Boss Baby, I guess, the ancient Greek Boss Baby. And it's fun. It's meant to be fun. It is a lot of fun. Now, a guy named Walter Otto and a different guy named Paul Vernant talk about Hermes' singularity. So Otto wrote this book called The Homeric Gods, and he argued that each of the Olympian gods, at least, had a singularity, had a thing that about them that was particular to them. That sort of separated them from the pack. Otto claims that for Hermes, that singularity, that singular quality, is joy. Vernant, on the other hand, argues that singular joy is movement. And so you could argue one way or the other. Hermes is generally a fairly joyful god. In Homeric hymn number 4, he makes a threat to an old man. There's an old man who overseas. I probably need battery changes on my alarm. Hope that doesn't happen again. That was sort of annoying. But Hermes sort of threatens the old guy and says to him, hey, you didn't see anything, right? Now, the old guy does actually tell Apollo, but there's no evidence that Hermes actually goes after the old guy. So Hermes does not seem to be quite as vindictive as some of the other gods, and he does seem to be fairly joyful. But he's also, in that poem and elsewhere, he is a god on the move, right? He's generally imagined as a god in motion. So in a sense, both things really apply to Hermes. And Vernant points out that in art, ancient art, if there are a group of gods, Hermes is often standing near Hestia. So she represents stillness and he represents movement. The scholarship is a selection from a book by a man named Hyde, but I want to comment on the in the lead up to that from Lewis Hyde's book, a thing that Maurizio sort of summarizes, and it's worth looking at and thinking about, and that's what William Doty and William Hines, who wrote a book on tricksters, and they point to 5 characteristics that tricksters generally have. And you can find that in the book. But those 5 characteristics definitely apply to Hermes. In Homeric hymn number 4, one of them doesn't really particularly apply, and there's another one that doesn't quite particularly apply. But Doty and Hines are not talking about just individual stories. They're talking about like the figure as a whole. And so if you look at all the stories of Hermes, the all 5 definitely do apply. But 3 apply, in spades in Homeric hymn number 4. The work from a neighboring culture that we have here is we have a hymn to the Egyptian god Thoth, and Hermes by the ancient Greeks was seen as an equivalent to Thoth, and in fact the city that had the temple of Thoth in ancient Egypt was renamed by the Greeks when it came under Greek control after Alexander the Great. It was changed to Hermopolis, the city of Hermes. So obviously the Greeks do see a connection between Hermes and Thoth, and that connection is actually pretty strong. Thoth is not so much a trickster figure, but they both are associated with the underworld. Hermes, escorts people to the underworld, and Thoth is involved in judging people in the afterlife. They both are associated with language. They're both like creators of language. And in some versions, Prometheus teaches humans how to write, like the alphabet, letters, and how to write. In other versions, Hermes does that, and Thoth does that for the Egyptians. And since the Egyptians had a writing system much older than the Greeks, Plato, in one of his dialogues, has Socrates criticize Thoth. The name is spelled differently, but criticizes Thoth for creating a writing system because, according to Socrates, that weakens the mind, right? So if the mind has to remember things, if it's always having to remember things and recreate things in the mind, then that mind is strong. But if you have like things in a book that you can always go to and you don't have to remember them, well, according to Socrates, that weakens the mind. And of course, I don't know what Socrates would do with the internet. He probably would lose his mind. And then so one last thing just to say about Hermes. I'm very fond of Hermes. Hermes is the god of in-betweens. And one other thing, since I am this time actually running ahead of schedule, Hermes is a trickster figure, and the scholarship here from Lewis Hyde looks at trickster figures. Tricksters are an archetype according to Carl Jung. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychoanalyst. He was a student of Freud. Then he broke with Freud. He sort of took a different path. And one of the things that's peculiar to Jung's theories of psychology and psychoanalysis is he thinks that the mind is actually sort of formulated to see archetypes. So these are like big character types. So the wise old man or the wise old woman would be a character type. The young person just starting the adventure, right? The newbie would be another archetype. And one archetype is the trickster figure. So the scholarship here is looking at archetypal ways of looking at myth, which is actually a good way of looking at them and its stories in general. So you could look at like Star Wars, and you've got the wise old man, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You've got the newbie in Luke Skywalker. You have the possibly cynical but really heroic Han Solo. You have the princess who's in distress, but of course she doesn't fall with the traditional way of telling that story where she's much more helpless. Princess Leia is not a helpless figure, but it still ties into that type. So I think you'll have a lot of fun with chapter 7, dealing with Hermes. Hermes is a fun god. Homeric hymn number 4 to Hermes is a lot of fun. And look at all the ways that Hermes in that poem sort of violates conventions, because one of the key things for trickster figures is that they don't follow tradition, right? They're sort of rule breakers. Think of class clowns, right? They know what the rules are, but they don't really always follow the rules, right? They skirt the edge. Now Hermes does actually know how far he can take stuff, because he plays tricks with Apollo, but when he comes up to Zeus, he plays tricks a little bit. But when Zeus basically says, yeah, you and Apollo have to figure this out, Hermes stops with the joking, right? He does know when to actually stop. So, and I know when to stop, which is right now. So that was chapter 7. Next time we'll look at chapter 8, which looks at Apollo and Artemis.